My guest today is Brendan Graham Dempsey. Dempsey is a key voice in the evolving Christian spirituality movement, and he is helping shape the future of Christianity by offering a dynamic response to a world that is eager to rethink Christian faith beyond outdated dogmas and doctrines. Dempsey's intellectual depth matches his creative insight, and he is a poet, a writer, and he holds a master's degree in religion and art from Yale University. As the author of Metamodernism and the Return of Transcendence, Dempsey offers reflections on spirituality within the context of metamodernism. His exploration of metamodern Christianity challenges rigid religious structures, rejects the exclusivity of evangelicalism, all in favor of paradox, inclusion, and intellectual and emotional engagement. Brendan, as Christianity is moving into its third millennium, it looks like, it appears, at least in the West, that it is going through huge, massive changes, culturally, socially, theologically. And I wanted to ask you, you're an observer of that as well. Why? Why is this happening? Why in the late 20th century, and then as the faith begins its third millennium, why is this happening, at least in the West?
Big question. Great question. I guess I'd see a number of strands unfolding. So I think that things are developing and moving in sort of different directions simultaneously. And then maybe one way into that question would be to try to identify what some of those major strands are. Because in some ways they're kind of operating at cross purposes, and there are different movements and different orientations. So yeah, I could try to maybe name a few of those major strands that I'm seeing. We could talk a little bit about that. One is sort of a continuation, I think, of something that we've been seeing for a while, which is, in a sense, Christianity, Western Christianity, American Christianity, depending on where we want to locate our particular lens on this, is grappling with modernity still, and that's unfolding in various ways in different contexts. So, growing up in an evangelical context, there was very much a sense of modernity and the modern being something like the enemy. Depending on how this got framed, it could be framed in very mythic terms, even that's something about the modern world was sort of in league with Satan and the devil, and there was this sense of tradition against modernity. When I was a kid, I didn't have language for it like that per se, but there was definitely this sense of we live in a fallen world, and that fallen world is increasingly moving into the currents of modernism and modernity. So secularism and pluralism, and a kind of breakdown in more familiar traditional values and family structures and that sort of a thing. So I grew up with that, and people trying to make sense of that. When I was, in my, early teens and before that, focus on the family was in my house a lot. So I was hearing people trying to process, what do we do with these sorts of ways of looking at things? And
so let me ask you. You're saying an interesting. You're obviously using. We know the words modernity, postmodernity. Is the kind of Christianity that became a very dominant form in American society in the 20th century, certainly tethering that back to the Protestant Reformation, is that and was that a product of modernity, and did that sense-making within modernity, in a sense, suddenly stop making sense?
Yeah, well, what would I say to that? There's a version of Christianity that harkens back to tradition, that itself is a product of modernity, right? That would be one way of thinking about it. A lot of the literature and theory that goes into exploring the issue of fundamentalism looks at it in terms similar to that, which is that when we look at fundamentalisms of various stripes, they seem to be defined by their sort of antagonistic relationship with modernity, of like navigating the modern world and trying to, in response, find something from the past and in tradition that they can, kind of very strongly affirm and create a world around. There are deep parallels and structural similarities between those kinds of approaches and approaches that were more sort of just indigenous to tradition. But I think when we look at 20th century forms of Christianity and we see a very kind of traditionalist form emerging there, we do have to situate that in the context of modernity itself, because that's kind of the other that it's being defined against.
Yeah.
And so I think the logic of that is sort of itself kind of influenced by modernity, even as it's reacting against it. I'm not sure if that gets at what you're trying to describe there, but that's kind of how I would situate some of these conservative responses to modernity as in some ways being modern responses themselves.
No, that makes sense of in the sense of how it grew out of that. But we're seeing now a decline and a running away from that. I mean, church attendance, church response, responses to, again, Western forms of Christianity are being thought of less and less. So I think I understand how it grew out of that. Why is it now saying, okay, I think we're kind of done or at the end of that?
Yeah, so that would be one of those major strands. And to kind of go back to that way of thinking about it, I think we're seeing different kinds of responses and different kinds of reactions. And so while there even might be a particular majority strand leading in one direction, I do think that all these are, in a sense, kind of sediments or layers that are happening concurrently. So while you do have still versions of that kind of reactive approach to modernity, trying to kind of dig into the fundaments and that sort of a thing, that kind of more conservative approach, that is still ongoing. But you're also describing something that's happened in the wake of that as well, which is that people have also seen the ways in which maybe that doesn't work. Maybe modernity is here to stay. Maybe some of the insights of modernity or even post-modernity are kind of engaged on their own terms and seem to be not the boogeyman that people thought they were. So on the one hand, you've got the kind of more conservative, more traditionalist lenses that are responding to Christianity in a modern world. On the other hand, we've had enough of that now that people are sort of we have enough people on the other side of it, sort of like that they've gone through that particular arc. We've seen the ascendancy of that particular strand, particularly like in the 90s and the 2000s, right? And I think that strand has also kind of crested in a certain way, so that now you have a whole kind of generation of people like myself who are navigating being on the other side of a certain kind of evangelicalism. And so I think a lot is going on there. Part of it is just the unfolding of people's life stories and seeing how effective or ineffective that particular strand has been to, sort of respond to the nature of the world that we live in, and how successful is that. For those who have found it unsuccessful, then you're going to find what we are finding in a lot of cases is people deconstructing, moving beyond it, moving post or ex-evangelical. And so that's another strand there. And I think that's also wound up with this other dynamic, which is there also is the move into this sort of postmodern moment that may or may not be attractive for people, either leaving that tradition and finding a home there. And so, yeah, it gets kind of messy, and I don't think that there's one single story here, but I think that we can follow some of these trajectories and see how they're all kind of going in various directions and maybe influencing each other and interacting in complex ways.
Yeah. So in summation, Brendan, what is the Christianity? What has been the Christianity of modernism? And then what is the Christianity of postmodernism? Those frameworks. And I know I'm partly then setting up something we'll talk about, the framework of metamodernism. But what has, just in bullet points, what's the Christianity of modernism and then the faith of postmodernism?
So I would say the Christianity of modernism comes in different shades, but it has a deep kind of structure to it. I think that structure is very individual focused. It focuses on the interiority. You brought up the Protestant Reformation earlier, and I think that that's a good place to look for the ascendancy of a fully kind of modernized notion of Christianity, which, is a lot about looking into the scripture yourself, right? Rather than taking things on authority. It's a lot about the interpersonal relationship and having a direct relationship with God. There's a lot in Protestantism that gets going in the early 16th century that is sort of very much in line with the sort of humanism of that early modern period.
That's right.
So you can definitely see Protestantism taking up some of that, but still obviously in a deeply religious mode. And when you contrast that with sort of the more traditional medieval style Christianity, which was more, based on that kind of authority, more ritual based, more communal based, that sort of thing, you see the shift into the individual, to the internal, to the critical reflective, right? We're going to look in the scriptures, we're going to do theology, and we're going to kind of argue based on what's said here, what's said there. We're going to bring in critical scrutinies and apply these new lenses to the text.
Yeah.
And so there are forms of Christianity and modernity that take on that coloration, and everything from a very kind of robust Protestantism to how that gets expressed kind of in the universities, in historical critical methods. You start seeing moves to demythologize the text and see the history as being primary here, trying to get down and apply modern methods of scrutiny to the text. So a number of modern Christianities show up, and
don't you even see? Don't you even, obviously you start to see historic criticism looking at origins or the authenticity of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But in the more conservative Protestant and evangelical world, again, applying the Enlightenment reason, they move into systematic theology, right, to defend biblicism. Is that?
Yeah. So then this is interesting because you can also apply sort of modern methods to maybe more conservative or traditional theologies, right? And in fact, I could try to make some connections in my own life, for example. But when I was coming out of a very conservative theological tradition, and when I say coming out of, I mean I should say being brought up in, I sought to, at a certain point, lean into apologetics and rationality, argumentation, evidence-based kind of reasoning to support my conservative theology, because that seemed to be the game to play. That's how you're supposed to establish things as being justified beliefs and whatnot. But it's interesting because that wasn't always kind of how that played out, right? That's a kind of modern move to be making there. So yeah, you do see this move into systematic theology and leveraging historical critical methods and other kinds of critical studies that come out of the modern era to, in some cases, try to prop up or justify or rationalize or make the case for kind of older theological modes. So all of those, you could say, are part of various kinds of modern Christianities, and to the degree that they're all wrestling with, hey, we're all reflective individuals to some degree who, have this reason, and we have the autonomy, and we have the ability to, base our beliefs on evidence and free inquiry, that sort of a thing. So what do you get when you do that? And that unfolds in various ways, but the mode of engaging, say, scripture and tradition and just Christianity in general is different than you could imagine it being, earlier in the kind of the pre-modern era where those weren't particularly, interesting or important or even conceivable notions.
Sure. So then maybe in a contemporary sense, separating the word contemporary from phases of modernity and postmodernity, in a contemporary sense, maybe mid 20th century, we begin to see shifts to postmodernism. And then, of course, towards the end of the century and beginning of this one. So then what is postmodern Christianity?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, comes in multiple shades, but there's kind of, I would argue, a deeper kind of structure there. I think what defines quintessentially or, prototypically sort of postmodern Christianities or Christian approaches is an emphasis on the systemic context in which people are operating as being potentially systems of oppressive powers, and trying to maybe leverage the Christian tradition to speak to that. One of the things that happens in sort of the postmodern move generally is that you get a critique of the modern, right? Hence the postmodern. So there's this move to situate the modern as being just a worldview among many, and one maybe that didn't succeed because it's just a bunch of rational, enlightened people, but maybe because they were leveraging systems of power and oppression, they were marginalizing outside groups, they were engaging in systemic colonialism or imperialism, etc. There's a number of critiques that show up against the modern project generally, and that, I think, broadly speaking, is what we can talk about in terms of the postmodern. And we can see that itself takes on, it gets picked up in Christian communities to speak to, the lived realities of Christians in the contemporary world. And so examples might be liberation theology, right, of looking at, basically applying biblical stories of liberation and emancipation, particularly from the Exodus tradition, to modern day political struggles. And you see this happen obviously in a big way in the civil rights era in America, and someone like Dr. Martin Luther King really drawing on that rich tradition to be able to speak to systems of oppression and how do we kind of alter that political landscape. That's one mode. I also think in an interesting and very fascinating field, the death of God theology movement is maybe you could situate as sort of a quintessentially sort of postmodern move, in the sense that one of the things that's also really important in sort of that postmodern moment is the rejection of any kind of transcendent ideals. The modern folks had shown up and they'd criticized the pre-moderns for having this, kind of supernatural conception of the world. But then the postmoderns show up and they critique the moderns by saying, well, you're kind of doing a similar version yourself with your enlightenment reason and, this universal brotherhood and this utopian vision and capital P progress. So they kind of leverage their critiques against that, and as a response, look to the world kind of as the world, not looking to, not looking to progress, not looking to move beyond, not looking to transcend, but just sort of sink into the world as it is and embrace kind of the immanent world as it is. And some versions of the Death of God movement kind of lean into that, of just radically engaging the immanent world as is, and again, interpreting the Christian tradition as sort of being, as gesturing to that kind of move. So other instances could be proposed, but those are I think probably. The Death of God theology movement was very fascinating, but it's probably more limited to the ivory tower. I think when people look around at the legacy of postmodernism, they're much more likely to see that in, really just generally progressive Christianity writ large. It's definitely a legacy. Oh, sorry, go on.
No. Go ahead. Finish your point.
I was just going to say, I think it's definitely a very positive legacy, but a clear one of sort of that postmodern critique of the modern in the Christian context of, pretty much every mainstream church around here in Vermont that I go by, you'll see a pride flag on there and say, everyone's welcome. And I think that is the legacy of, again, the church sort of responding to perceived systemic oppression and marginalization by the church of certain communities, and trying to actively get in front of that and say, actually, we interpret the message of Jesus as being about inclusivity, acceptance, grace, these sorts of things. So, that would have been well, it was just certainly non-existent, very unusual, rare, say 50 years ago. And now, and maybe certainly this is related to the fact that I live in Vermont. So obviously this isn't ubiquitous, but I think those kinds of moves that we see becoming more mainstream are a legacy of the postmodern Christian moment.
Yeah, and these things obviously happen and perhaps need to happen, and they cook and bake a while, right? Because obviously, when history looks back at the Protestant Reformation, we always go back to 1517, and we go back to Luther nailing his theses to the Wittenberg door. Yet, what we do know historically, that was something that was baking 100 years before.
Yeah.
So to where we are now, when you think of post-Civil War American Christianity, and then kind of pointing everything to American evangelicalism of the 20th century, and then all of its versions of it, this counter movement also began. You start to have the fundamentalist controversy in the late 1800s into the 1900s. You start having Paul Tillich, a Lutheran, talk about different things at Harvard Divinity. You have the Jesus Seminar at the end of the 80s. Brian McLaren, who is an evangelical darling, then starts shifting and writing about it in the 90s. And then, of course, Rob Bell, an evangelical darling, then also starts shifting. So these things are cooking. So, Brendan, is this this massive thing called deconstruction, Christian deconstruction, it's a product of postmodernism, correct?
Yeah, I think that you can read it that way, and I think that there's a good reason to. I mean, it's in the word itself, right? Deconstruction famously comes from kind of postmodern theory popularized by Derrida.
Right.
In this sense, used rather differently, but there's clearly just in the use of that word speaking to some structural similarity. In this case, a de-structural similarity, which is that something built is being taken apart. And to the degree that postmodernism in general was a critical move, right? Then inherent to various postmodern moves is a taking things apart, scrutinizing, analyzing, not yet building again, and maybe even giving up entirely on the prospect that building things is within its purview. But definitely a notion of sort of taking something and smashing it in a kind of either defiant act, in a kind of almost a move of social justice to destroy systems of oppression act, a kind of further radicalization of modern critical thought act, right? That you're further even scrutinizing modern thought on its own terms of rationality. So anyway, I think that I'm very comfortable using that notion of deconstruction to signal something kind of prototypically postmodern in that way. And when applied to, Christian life and what people are going through, I think it's very fair to see that as sort of a part of the postmodern moment.
Yeah. And, Brendan, I'm the lead minister of a church that really started in 2018 and really grew out of this post-evangelical deconstruction movement. I went through I was 30 plus years an evangelical, not just an evangelical clergy. And then I just couldn't do it anymore, theologically, doctrinally, culturally, exceptionally, a religion that had exceptionalism as its highest, we're the best, we're the right, and we need to spread it and make sure the world is turned over and converted by it. I just couldn't do it anymore. And so the church arose out of that, and 2018 isn't that long ago, it's right. And what I'm already quickly seeing in my own heart and even in the congregation I lead, that want Christian spirituality, and that's the term we use. We even use the term Christian spirituality way over the term Christianity. But what we're seeing, and I'm seeing, is deconstructing our American evangelicalism was part of it and needed to happen. There needed to be a travel journey, but this deconstructed state is not, it's not where you can live. You can't, unless you leave the whole thing altogether. And there are some that have left it altogether. And by the way, I don't have the kind of Christianity that if somebody leaves it altogether, I'm not even critical of that. I get that. But what we have found is for those of us that can't go back to that, we also can't live here. So, right, there seems to be something else happening. This, right, where we seem to be moving forward towards something.
Yeah.
Is that, and that's a lot of what you talk about.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's really well said. It's deconstruction, and I can speak about this theoretically, but I can also speak about it personally in my own faith journey. Can be a necessary act, but it's not a place that you can live your life from necessarily. At least for me, I also found that to be very difficult to live in. Not just critical scrutiny or skepticism, but there's a particular flavor or version of it that can definitely lead you to a kind of nihilism. That there's a sense of radical doubt and radical cynicism. I think that occurs when really the entire approach to your meaning and your worldview and your conception of authority figures and institutions, all of that just has sort of lost its luster, to put it mildly. And there is a sense of, well then what? Well then who's to say? And what does any of this mean? And I think that while that is and has been for me an important movement, if you live from there for an extended duration of time, it begins to lead to a kind of vertigo or uncertainty, radical disorientation. Then how does one move forward? What are one's centers of value? How do you even begin to adjudicate meaning or value? Is all of this just a social construct? These are great questions, right? But it's a kind of radical skepticism that can have a sort of corrosive aspect to it. And as someone who spent a number of years there, at a certain point, I do think that there's a kind of organic momentum that comes out of that, of its own accord almost, that it's sort of like, okay, got to move on. And then it's like, but where to from here? And I think that is sort of the setup to these big questions that, kind of Western Christianity is facing in the contemporary moment. And
when I was a evangelical minister and went through even the late 20th century, early 21st century iterations of that, and usually those iterations were methodological, we're changing certain methods. When it came to teaching or sermons I needed to write, there were always handrails I could hold on to. I had, at least in Protestantism, I already had 500 years of, okay, man, this is what our theology is. And that's whether you're part of the secret church or radical charismatic, there's still, you still, okay, this is what we believe. So you had these handrails. And then when I deconstructed, and now there's like no handrails. There's like, we're in this move that's exciting. So you spend a lot of time talking about as we move from modernism to postmodernism to now, you spend a lot of time talking about two things: metamodernism and then a metamodern Christianity. So let's go there. Brendan, what is metamodernism? And then what is metamodern Christianity?
Yeah, big questions.
Yeah, I know.
And
I know you have tons of hours on your wonderful YouTube channel, and here I'm going, hey man, I get it. So yeah, I get it.
No, they're critical questions, crucial questions, and I'll give you my take, right? And part of what is very exciting about this is that this really is something that's emerging, it's growing, it's nascent, and it's being co-created as well. So I can talk to you about my notions and the work that I'm doing, trying to formulate ideas around this. But this is really. I don't want to give the impression that, because I spend a lot of my time in this space talking about this topic, that there's any kind of sense that I've got the answer. But that said, I think that metamodernism can be understood, broadly speaking, as what comes after postmodernism. And there are particular kind of characteristic moves that we see defining this metamodern moment and this metamodern paradigm. So a lot of my work has been trying to focus on what do we see that broadly characterizes that across the board, as people have been talking about this in different places. You've got metamodern art that kind of got the conversation going back in the 2010s in kind of a whole cultural analysis there. But you've also got some systematic philosophy that's being developed by people like Ananda Josephson Storm that's been very influential. You've got
what was some of the metamodern art, maybe music, because how you can be involved in this, you go, I didn't even know that's what it was. So
yeah, I think a great kind of classic example is Wes Anderson, who I just grew up loving naturally. I actually got introduced to Wes Anderson works by my youth pastor when I was a kid, and there was something about that quirky style that I really resonated with. Yeah. I think he really is a good, again, sort of prototype of this sensibility. One of the things you see in metamodern art generally, and Wes Anderson's a good example, is this kind of re-engagement with the sincere or the earnest, right? That there's kind of a return of innocence a little bit, but it's not a kind of naive innocence. In the background that there's a knowingness to all of this, that Wes Anderson, in having a movie like Moonlight Kingdom about this budding romance between two precocious kids, isn't just this kind of kitschy, saccharine kind of display. It's a kind of ironically self-aware thing that's going on there, and yet it sort of willingly embraces the sincere and the earnest. And so you see this a lot in metamodern artworks. Ted Lasso is another example. So I would say, broadly speaking, what you see is people have gotten a bit bored with, if nothing else, the kind of cynicism that they've seen in postmodern work, right? Postmodern art showed up, and it was, at the time, very radical, and it was sort of novel, and you didn't know what was going to happen, and so there was an energy and excitement there.
Is the popularity of Banksy? Banksy is his art is about deconstruction, right? It's about looking at the modern world and saying, hey man, we're kind of done with that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so there's a lot of irony in Banksy's work, and there's a lot of irony in postmodern work generally. If you think of like Fight Club or some of that kind of work, Natural Born Killers, just these really just savage critiques of the modern world, of consumerism and all these things. But also
where's Tarantino fit in?
Oh yeah, definitely. He's a classic, I would say, the postmodern director, with some moves into the metamodern, actually. Sure. Which there's a great article. Well, I don't want to nerd out too much about some of the
I will for a moment. So back to Ted Lasso and its popularity, and then framing it within metamodernism against postmodernism.
Yeah.
is Ted Lasso is the sentimentality, which isn't kitschy or cheesy, which maybe sometimes modernism can be. But the sentimentality and the sincerity of, look, it's okay to be a good guy, and to is that what makes Ted Lasso metamodernistic?
Yeah. I think it's precisely that. It's the awareness that this is an option. It's not a naive sincerity, and I think that that's important. It's knowing that you can be cynical, and most people are, and maybe there's actually really good reason to be cynical, and yet choosing to be earnest and wishing the good anyway, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
You see that there's so much that can and should be critiqued, but critique doesn't ultimately get us anywhere if it just stays in critique, in the same way that deconstruction doesn't kind of allow you a place to live from if you're just staying in deconstruction. So,
yeah, and if I could just give a personal to what you're saying. So when I deconstructed my Christian faith, there is this, hey, right? There is this, we've got to change this. We've got to stop that. And, there might be some literal things, you have to, right? If we don't deconstruct, we don't get the civil rights movement. If we don't deconstruct, we don't dismantle colonialism. If we don't deconstruct, we don't get the equality of women, and then many other social ills and all of this, right? So there needs to be this, hey, enough. But, right, so that partly happened as I left evangelical faith. But then, Brendan, what I started to experience is, well, I don't want to be cynical all of my life, and I don't want to be critical of all of my life. There is also something there is a transcendent intrigue, interest, draw. I still want to be a loving, caring, compassionate fellow. And I've seen this with my congregation, those that go, hey, I'm going to stick around in Christian spirituality. But they go, I can't stick around for cynicism and tearing something down. Right? Is that?
Yeah. I think that's exactly right. And I think there's a crucial metamodern move that happens here, because that, hey, things have to change. It is a critical move, but you can see that in the background there's values, right? You're saying this isn't okay. And so you're saying something is wrong, but you're also implying something else is right. And that's a lot of what the postmodern doesn't do. And it stays in the, hey, this is wrong. But it's not too hard to read even the most cynical postmodern works as suggesting values of importance, right? Even those Banksy works you're talking about are saying, isn't it absurd that this is what we're doing? And in the background of that is to suggest that we could be doing something different that would be good. And so I think that the metamodern move is to switch that up and say, let's foreground what those positive things are. And let's talk about what we are actually gesturing to in our value. And, it classically in a lot of sort of postmodern discourse, there's a lot of framing things in terms of isms and, let's say, homophobia and sexism and these sorts of things. But again, implicit in there is our values. And so rather than necessarily framing that negatively, how can we frame our values positively in a way that kind of puts them on the table? The thing about it is that opens you up to critique, right? And so there's a kind of willingness one has to engage in to do that, to say, you know what, I know that when I say what I actually think about this in positive terms, people can tell me I'm wrong and people can tell me all the reasons why that doesn't check out. But, I'm making that next move. And I think that there's a kind of bravery that goes into that, that is also an invitation for people as well. But it's also, by doing that, there needs to also be that humility, right? People can say, but I could be wrong. I'm open to new things. I'm open to perspectives. I'm open to this. Here's what I think. What do you think? And on the whole, I think that is sort of the antidote to that corrosive toxicity that we find in so much of that negativity of well-meaning postmodern deconstruction, right?
So what are some of those positive attributes of metamodernism we are moving towards?
Yeah,
I realize they might not be fulfilled yet. We're in process.
Mm-hmm.
But what are some of these, instead of attributes, and I mean this as a compliment, I'll call them ideals.
Yeah.
And I mean that in the best of sense.
Yeah.
What are some of these ideals that frame metamodernism?
Yeah. Well, for me, a big one is a return of something like progress, right? So much of postmodern thought was criticizing modernists for having these progressive utopian visions that ultimately led to terrible things, right? Totalitarianism and the 20th century wars. And so they were right to be deconstructed and critiqued in that way. But in the process, a lot of our whole notion that things can get better got just summarily rejected. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing is that, no, things can be better. They can also be worse. And just acknowledging that already, you've kind of moved out of a sort of postmodern relativism. And so I think that something like progress comes back, which is very important, I think, if one wants to be progressive. It's always been a little bit of a kind of irony that, progressive voices have had such a trouble with the notion of progress, precisely because of its legacies of leading to, not progress. And so I think the metamodern move allows us to acknowledge all of that and say, yeah, the human beings have tried various things that have ended tragically, catastrophically. We've had our ideals take us to terrible places. This seems to happen over and over again. We're imperfect, and yet, what is the other option? Give up on trying to make a better world? Give up on any notion of there being better or worse? So I think that move is important, of being able to say, you know what, there is a better direction we can head in, and let's just say that. And I think that, that begins to now offer some of those handrails, you could say, to come back, right? Whereas if everything is just under scrutiny and critique, you don't have that. But if you can begin to say, I can at least situate that I'm saying this is worse and this is better. Let's move in this direction. Let's try to get there together. Then if you can do that, then you have a North Star. You have North Stars again, and you can begin to do the sorts of work that I think people intuit needs to happen, of creating a more just and a more flourishing, a more sustainable society together. But that has not necessarily been able to be communicated very clearly in a kind of purely critical, deconstructive mode.
Yeah. I love this. This is so encouraging for me that we're talking about a move forward for humanity. And then here, Brendan, here Christianity is moving within all of these isms we talked about: traditionalism, then modernism, then postmodernism, and now here we are and I'll just say this as a compliment to you, other cognitive scientists, social observers, philosophers, artists, theologians, seem to have a collective agreement that we are moving into this metamodern era. So then there's Christianity in this that has kind of gone through all of this. And if it sticks around, and I think it will, it inevitably will shift with it. I always say that doesn't mean there's something wrong with the faith. That's everything right with the faith, that it evolves and move with it. So as we have metamodernism, now there is this thing you talk about, metamodern Christianity. So what is metamodern Christianity?
Well, caveats aside again, my view is that just as you were saying earlier that, Luther nailing the 95 Theses to the door in Wittenberg didn't happen in a vacuum. It had sort of been led up to already by some time. I think we've seen intimations of a metamodern Christianity for some time. And I think that, even in my own faith journey, I've kind of encountered here and there some elements that, in retrospect, I could say that lands nicely in sort of a metamodern register. And some of them you already did name, in fact, and I can zoom in on some of them in particular.
Please do.
But like I would say, Brian McLaren represents probably one of the best figures that I think is speaking to some of this. And particularly, he has a wonderful way of talking about how faith develops and changes over time. He has a kind of developmental thinking and a model about faith, and it's a very
totally agree.
Yeah, very wonderful, accessible, understandable one. It's very relatable, at least in my experience, and so in there you can see that there is a kind of progression of sorts that, and I think this is really an important point about this move out of a postmodern deconstruction mode into a reconstructive mode is you talked about that feeling of having no handrails and this sense of what now, what are North Stars? And a lot of that critical mode of postmodernism leads to a kind of uncertainty and a skepticism and a kind of inherent relativism of like, well, I don't want to be doing any kind of terrible power move here, so you can do what you do and I can do what I do, and there's just no one to say. But again, for the reasons we were talking about a second ago, we can see when things are better or worse. We can see when civil rights are taken away, that's not good, and we want to have a world where that doesn't happen. We can see that when the beauty of the natural world is destroyed and commodified, that's not good. We want a sustainable future. We can see, and then we can say a number of things of what we can intuit would be a better, more holistic, more accepting, more loving, more compassionate world. These are values that we can affirm. And so there is an axis of sort of like what moves us closer to that versus what gets us further away. And so I think that being able to think in those terms opens up new possibilities. And McLaren's work is great for tracking, what opens us up, what allows our faith to develop into these new spaces. And so, I wrote a book called Metamodernism, or the cultural logic of cultural logics. And one of the points I try to make there is that in metamodernism, I think we see the very notion of these shifts from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern, those kinds of shifts. We can reflect on that, and we can ask the question, like, is this unfolding in a particular direction? Is this going anywhere as these shifts occur? Is there a developmental aspect even to some of these things, right? Does postmodernism's awareness of systemic oppression, does that get us further than, say, modern oppression and its blindness, to those problems? Like, was there actual progress there? Is there something progressive about how these things lead to the next? And without being overly simplistic about it, because history is very messy and certainly complex, I do think that we can affect a kind of optimistic stance to that. We can imagine a situation in which learning more and connecting with more people, of hearing more diverse perspectives and moving in the direction of that kind of progressive orientation is opening us up and is moving us forward in that sense. And in that way, we can see that these unfoldings do potentially grow one on top of the other and open up new horizons as that happens. And I think that McLaren's work shows that and talks about that for our faith as well, and is able to say, where are you coming from? What's your lens that you're using? And as that unfolds, I think that we have the capacity to move into that space together, and that's one way of talking about a metamodern Christianity that takes in the way that things develop and unfold on themselves itself as its sort of vision of awareness, and works with that. Hopefully that's clear. I'm not sure. Maybe there's some stuff
No, and no, great. Just keep, no, this is great. And let me just say something about Brian McLaren. I don't know him real well, but I don't think I'd still be in any kind of Christianity if it wasn't for Brian's mind and heart, and really daring to go beyond, and Rob Bell too. Brendan, I would say most of my audience is probably of the deconstruction sort, but they deconstructed from evangelicalism. So they have familiarity with both of those things, the language that frames evangelical faith, then their feelings and experiences, which are important, of deconstructing. And then I'm just going to imagine something for them, just based on my own experience and then the congregation I serve, is they're still around because they're sensing this whole thing in them and around them is moving forward, and they're excited about what that means for their own Christian spirituality, and then Christian spirituality up ahead. So let me ask you, like a bunch of questions. I mean, I'll ask them, you answer. I'll ask them, you answer.
Lightning round.
Yeah, right. And yeah, in metamodern Christianity, what happens to Jesus? What is the metamodern Christ of metamodern Christianity?
Yeah, I relate to the metamodern Christ in the sense of something beyond just what happened, in 30 AD in Palestine. When I relate to that figure, it is so much bigger than that. It is, yes, it includes what happened historically in order to get this whole thing going, but it also includes the 2,000 years since then, and all of the unfoldings and developments and progressive shifts and updates. All of that to me is sort of taken into this figure. So I don't look to the metamodern Christ as, let's say, opening up the Gospels and trying to get at, what did Jesus actually say in this moment? Because it differs from maybe how it's expressed in Matthew versus Luke, and I need to parse this out. I think that, and I've spent a good amount of time doing that kind of work in my biblical studies career. But in terms of the faith element there, I think the more powerful relationship is one to a being that is about something, that is representative of something, and that I have contact with that as well. So it's a move into more of the archetypal realm here. I see the metamodern Christ as being that icon that draws me towards my best self, that represents and instantiates the best self, that represents and instantiates that full unity of human and divinity, the full unity of what we are and what we could be. I see the metamodern Christ as calling forth a radical opening to expand our social horizon and to consider others who are left out of our sense of identity or social circle as ourselves, and to relate to them as such. And so I see the metamodern Christ as, again, substantiating, representing, calling forth this movement to become a bigger, better, kinder, more compassionate, more humane, and more sacred, more divine human being as best as I possibly can. That's how I think I relate
Yes.
to that.
No, this is really good. And I think people are feeling that probably more than they can articulate that like you do so well. I think, one of the banners of reformational Christianity or evangelical Protestant Christianity, right? One of the things it says about itself is it is a confessional faith. So it needs to confess Jesus is Lord. It needs to confess Jesus as King. It needs to confess Jesus as Savior. I think you're right. I think, oddly and ironically, the metamodern Christian move it really is moving Jesus from those things to Jesus the Christ.
Mm.
We've been calling Jesus Jesus Christ for 2,000 years, but what you're explaining is Christness, that this instead of something we confess that validates whatever, a supernatural shift or my allegiance to someone and something, what is making Jesus compelling, intriguing, interesting as we process this archetype Christ as a figure that is alive in me today. And just like all of these things we have said, Jesus is alive. It's not just somebody, a 33-year-old man alive from a tomb, but no, this archetype is alive in me and in this place I'm moving towards. Does that?
I love it. Yes, and I love the phrase, the term Christness. I think that captures something I'm trying to express, which is that you've kind of made this category now to more fully encapsulate the fullness of something, which I think is the call of the religious life, is to live into the greater fullness, not just to maybe have a particular propositional relationship with a set of creeds or doctrines or do a particular set of rituals. It is to see what is the essence that holds across all of Jesus's encounters, across all of the Christian history of 2,000 years as well, to what have we deepened into collectively as we've tried to move into this. And we've, in a sense, abstracted more and more of that essence in a way that has continued to unfold. And so I think that that's exactly right. And one other aspect I would add to that I think is a particularly kind of emphasis in metamodern context is that Christ is all of those different moments of the process as well, right? So there isn't necessarily, let's say, how do I want to say something like, in McLaren's, for example, those stages that people might move through over the course of their faith journey, you can't jump or skip any of them, right? In the sense of you've got to work through it. And so because of that, all of them are necessary and important and valid. And so even though this Christness might be continuing to grow and expand and evolve, we can appreciate each moment of that as it's unfolded historically in its own terms and appreciate it for what it added to the entire wholeness and fullness of it.
Totally. So, yes. And it doesn't make Jesus of Nazareth any less attractive or any less of a teacher. Let me talk about metamodern Christianity and then the ancient scriptures, the Bible. Again, part of what dominated American Christianity since the Reformation is words like truth, and that the idea that the Bible, literalistically, biblicistically, it actually is the supernatural word of God. Certainly, as evangelicals like to say, written by humans, of course, but through a supernatural whisper of God going, write this down. Right. And then so we have God's words. It seems then as deconstruction has happened, people are deconstructing that viewpoint, literalism, biblicism, and as it collides with a contemporary world where it doesn't always fit. So, in metamodern Christianity, what happens to the Bible, or how does the Bible, where does it head in metamodern Christianity?
Yeah, this was such a big thing for me because this was really the source and origin of my own deconstructive journey, having gone into studying biblical history, biblical composition, and that sort of thing, and having that process unfold for me, as you said, to have to come to terms with and take a different view on what these texts are and what they mean for us and where they come from. So again, I think appreciating that this metamodern move is, it moves beyond the postmodern, but it carries with it all the insights that have accumulated along this progression from the pre-modern to the modern to the postmodern. So the metamodern does restore and reconstruct something, but it's doing so in light of all of what's come, including modern historical criticism, including the various kinds of pluralistic and perspectival and power analyses that come from the postmodern tradition. So yeah, what on the other side of all that does the Bible look like? For me, I view it, I do find the library metaphor very helpful, and thinking about this as a collection of texts that was written over a very long time by a lot of different people, and all of them relating in some way to a singular topic that does bring some kind of cohesion or unity to this rather diverse and disparate set of texts, which is, in a sense, the wrestling with God, right? Which is, what is God? Who is God? What does God want from us? What is the divine? What is the sacred? And of course, then once the Christian tradition picks up, who is Jesus and what is the Christ and all this? And in that plurality of voices that you find in the Bible, there are different answers to that, and that's okay. There are contradictions. There are different takes. And so I think the beauty that can return to Scripture, one level of it is just appreciating this legacy that's been left of this divine human interaction that people have been wrestling with for so much time, and to take it on its own terms. Now, more than that, I think that there is actually a progression in that legacy, that it's not just a bunch of different perspectives, that there's actually something moving through and unfolding and clarifying across that process as well. And again, this is a big way that I think developmental ways of thinking can really inform our faith. This is a big part of the work I'm doing at the moment in this, writing this big work at the moment called The Evolution of Meaning, where I'm really going through and looking at the different kind of moments of the God concept as it shifts through the biblical and Christian record. So what I'm getting at is that I think that the Bible can be related to as a profound history marking that unfolding, developing process. It's almost like we have these various snapshots of like a flower growing and then coming to unfold. And each part of that, each snapshot gives us a part of the picture of that whole, but you have to see it more like a flip book rather than just this static thing that's saying one thing. I find that to be particularly profound and beautiful. On top of that, though, I think we can see in, say, the New Testament and in the Gospels and in the teachings of Jesus in the Gospels, again, material that we can abstract and see in our own lives and relate to, and engage in the process of trying to see that Christness in all of that. And so when you read the parables, right, and you read these teachings, and it doesn't just certainly have to be the Gospels. I mean, beautiful sections in Paul's writings, beautiful sections in the Johannine literature about, about love, that we can see a kind of bigger image there that's composed of a number of snapshots. And then we can start to see what is that essence, what is that gestalt, and how does that apply to today, and how does that even expand and continue to grow? All of that, I feel like we have a basis for by relating to the scriptures in that way. So it provides us some source material that we can then begin to sort of live with and live into and be participatory with as well, to see how that continues to grow and expand.
So good, so good. And you started that thing, and I fully agree. I think the metaphor of the library written by humans over time is it's been so helpful for me too. And I think one of the things our tradition has obviously celebrated is that the Hebrew Scriptures and then the New Testament together, it's part of a spiritual life. The Scriptures be integral to a person's spiritual life. But here for me has been the irony and the positivity of what you just said. The ironic part is when they remain only literal, and then that literalism has to define a sense of history. When they remain literal and then they have to have a universal moral ethic or a universal doctrinal ethic, it seems to limit spirituality. And it seems like if they can evolve beyond literalism, Christianity will continue to do what it has always done, which is allow a human being to be spiritual. In a more evolving way. It seems like a supernatural author. This is what's going to sound weird and ironic. To give it a supernatural author, and then this is the Word of God, puts a limiter and a governor on this divine entity we're all trying to wrestle with and figure out. Does that make sense?
Very much. And this is one of those insights that can help us by appreciating that modern move to historicize, but not getting stuck in historicism. When we can appreciate that the Bible is a historical product and comes from a particular moment in time, then we can see what it did in that time and appreciate it on those terms. But we can also see that obviously we're in a different time, and then how do we relate these across these differences? And so I think that seeing what is, you can almost say it this way, what is the radical aspect for its time that you can identify in that historical context, and then abstract that, because that's probably going to get you that taste of that Christness, right? And so even though maybe in the past, when we look back on the various moments of even like various forms of political progress, we can see that there are moments that were a move forward, but by today's standards, they're still not enough, right? And so we shouldn't, as a result of that, look at that moment and denigrate it as not being enough. We should say this was really crucial to get us to where we are. And hopefully we're going to continue this process and continue to do the work of building this cathedral. And in that future times, we'll look back at us and say, wow, things were really rough then too, but these folks did this, and be part of the process of continuing to, see that flower develop. One additional thing I do want to mention, though, is that I really do think it's important to even broaden our notion. I don't want to necessarily say of scripture, because that might be a little bit too much to talk about for some people, but at least canon. One of the things that I think unfortunately did happen as a consequence of the Protestant Reformation was that we did kind of lose a lot of the richness of the tradition of the 2,000 years of history and development that had occurred by going back to this sort of sola scriptura approach. And what I would advocate is that, to see Christ as being more than just in the Gospels, but being in the whole legacy of sacred history, of the whole unfolding of Christianity and beyond. And when you do that, then you're open to all the mystical literature, this, Dionysius the Areopagite and Bonaventure and Meister Eckhart and Julian of Norwich and, Teresa, all these incredible Christian thinkers, feelers, experiencers, theologians, mystics. That's part of that story as well. And so I think that we can also take that up as part of that expanding library and appreciate those in similar terms.
I totally agree. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. And yes, and that, we're not supposed to mess with the canon. And I think you're absolutely right. And when you can humanize the process, that's my irony. When you humanize the whole process, it actually moves us to spirituality. When you divineness, supernatural the whole process, it seems to limit spirituality. That's my thought.
Yeah.
So that moves me to this idea of metamodern Christianity and truth. So when you look at when Christianity was within the bounds of traditionalism, very much in an illiterate world, then truth was within the bounds of the church. The church determined the truth and said, this is what truth is. As we get to the Reformation, as it's parallel with the Enlightenment, then at least in Christianity, sola scriptura, the Bible became the truth. Now we're moving beyond postmodernism into metamodernism. So what will be Christianity's dance with truth? And then before you answer that, let me just give this caveat in a localized way in my own congregation. Brendan, I don't use the word truth in our church just because it's so loaded. I will use two words. I will with an adjective. I will use the phrase actually true, or I will use the phrase trueness, but I don't use truth. So, and that's part of evangelicals' defense and or criticism to this whole move away, is that we're being heretical towards the truth. So what's metamodernism, Christianity, and truth?
So we've been talking a lot about evolution and development and change over time and expanding the scope and all of this. For me, I think the same logic applies to the level of truth, to the topic of truth. So if you think, for example, of what you thought was true over the course of your own life, not just what you thought was true, but how you thought things were true. There are interesting patterns to that, actually. It's not just some linear thing. It's not just some static thing. There are actual kind of ways that people think in terms of what is true. And, I spent a lot of time reading a lot of developmental psychology literature. So, but without getting into all those details, which are, for the record, though, very implicit in McLaren's work. He's drawing on these kinds of approaches. The point would be that our minds change and evolve and develop over time. And as we do that, the way that we relate to reality and conceive of what is true in reality shifts. But the point is that I guess that I would want to make is that this on the one hand, does force us to grapple with, there is no capital T truth the way that it wants to be imposed in some sort of authoritative and absolutistic sense. Once you deconstruct from that, what are you left with? And a lot of people are left with a kind of relativism that can be difficult to make sense of, because they're sticking in this notion of, well, things are about perspectives, right? It's about your perspective and my perspective, and who's to say. I think one of the moves that can be done, which I do see as a really helpful metamodern move, is to say, this is all true. We can, though, also orient ourselves to those perspectives. We can start to relate them to each other. We can start to coordinate them in the same way that, we can recognize that how when I was 10 years old, my notion of God was very different from it was when I was 20. It's very different from what it is today. And so I think that this sort of progressive notion of truth can be helpful because it can speak to those folks who recognize that absolutistic notions are too simplistic and often come with a lot of baggage and a lot of power dynamics that can be really unhelpful and pathological. So yes, that's not right. That's not a helpful way of looking at it. Simultaneously, though, we can see the limits of sort of just saying that there isn't truth in any radical sense because, ironically, right, that's a truth claim. And I'm not sure how familiar people are with this kind of approach, but you do get into some interesting little kind of contradictions when trying to grapple with the implications of perspectivalism, of sort of like, well, it's all a matter of perspective. And it's like, well, that's your perspective. It's like, yes, but that holds true for all perspectives. It's like, well, wait a second, you just undermined what you were saying.
Right.
And that's not just wordplay. That's actually an important tension in the very notion there. And again, I think if people really thought a lot about it and felt into it, they would actually say that that's not even really what they mean, right? The very fact that they're saying that people who want to come in and say there's absolute truth and let me tell you what it is, and if you disagree with me, you're wrong, and ... they will say that's not better. That's a worse way of doing this, and there's a better way of doing this, and it's called being sensitive to context, being sensitive to perspectives, all this, right? So what I'm pointing at there is that there's an implicit notion that even when it comes to truth, as with value, there's a sense in which some things might be more true. And while we can't necessarily have some absolute truth or some view from nowhere truth, we can get a sense of what is contextually true in a better sense than in other ways. And if we can do that, then again, we've got some more handrails we can use. And for those who might hear that and say, ooh, that sounds dangerous because, that sounds like another club people can use to hit over people's heads. What I think is really encouraging is that what we learn from how people's notions of truth and value develop in a kind of developmental way is that it leads in that direction of openness. It leads in that direction of pluralism and a receptivity to the other. And so I think we do want to privilege that. We want to say it's better to be more open to diverse perspectives. It's better to recognize that simplistic notions of truth aren't true. But all of that does imply a certain way of thinking about truth that I think can actually get us that kind of progressive movement that we're getting at. But again, it flips a critique into a positive statement that allows us to get there.
Yeah. Because there's a different... the idea of truth and as Christianity moves forward and beyond, it's either embrace or wrestle or definition of truth, right? So you could say, going back to Christ's certain parable teachings, you go, that is a universal trueness. Let's say about compassion. Okay, that remains true. Or what we think of, one of the cornerstones of the Christian tradition, which is the golden rule. Treat somebody how you want to be treated, right? And other perennial, there other religions have that perennial type of truth in it as well. That's still different than when someone is going, did Jesus walk on water? And did an executed human being rise from the dead? And then when one has to define what is true to treat somebody, like that's just there's a trueness that carries to then a doctrinal thing, right? Is this where you're saying not all truth or what is true is equal?
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting. I mean, a word even like truth can have a lot of baggage, a lot of associations that that we should take into account and are really important. So, I wouldn't want to let's say for folks for whom the notion of truth that's been a kind of weaponized thing that's led to a lot of hurt and pain, let's say, right? What I'm not trying to suggest is that we somehow reclaim that old notion of truth. I think that what I'm trying to get at is that there are ways of appreciating some of what was of value in the orienting notion, that kind of abstract aspect of, the truthness of something. We can see that in ways that can actually be really meaningful for us and helpful for us, that are separated from that kind of absolutistic way of thinking. And so I guess what I'm saying is that, what are those then? Those are kinds of different sorts of truths that maybe themselves undergo a kind of progression or evolution or change. I think that as we're experiencing today, very unfortunately, in our public space, in our political discourse, we're, I think, unfortunately, being reminded of how truth can be really valuable when related to correctly, or let's say appropriately, healthfully, right? We know what it's like when people lie to us, and in that sense, we'd say, no, that's not good, and that was not true, and that hurt us. We know what it looks like when people propagandize to us and they try to sell us false narratives, and we can see the danger and the harm that those do. So I think we intuit also that there's something like truth that we want to be able to affirm without necessarily having that fall back into some simplistic, absolutistic notion of truth. And I think, I could try to unpack a lot of philosophical arguments, but I won't do that. It can be done, and it's, I think, important work to do. I guess maybe I'll just invite people to sit with that, at least tension, and mull that over a bit, because I think going forward, in the immediate future, we really have to kind of reconsider what the legacy of truth is after this postmodern deconstructive moment. And again, I would invite people to consider that in the sorts of ways I'm talking about, which is that rather than critique truth, what are we implicitly suggesting in that critique that has a set of truth claims associated with it that we could frame in positive terms, right? If what we're saying is, we don't like and we reject the notion of an absolutistic, sort of doctrinally, dogmatically imposed notion of truth. What is that carving out in sort of the negative space that we could try to flip and frame positively? That's the invitation, and I think wrestling with that could start to reveal some powerful things of what we could say we could call true, and maybe there'd be really interesting resonances there with other areas in our life where we seek for some kind of truth against falsity and find it there as well. So we don't necessarily benefit, I think, from throwing away truth entirely. We benefit from throwing away false notions of truth. So can we true truth, right, in a verb sense? Can we make true more true? How do we understand that? Is that possible? How can we get there? Those are questions, I think, that are metamodern.
Yeah, no, and that's precisely that is so well said. That's why I use the word true or trueness versus truth. And, I do come back to, in the Christian tradition where Jesus teaches the truth will set you free. The Greek word aletheia, it means two things. It certainly, I stand by, it does not mean a doctrinal truth. It means two things. It means what is actually true. That's aletheia, means what is actually true. And then it means a trueness or a truth that comes to you by things unfolding, veils coming off, seeing things because something new has bloomed.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I think we have to have an intimate connection. That needs to be a real virtue of our tradition.
Yeah, and just on that point, I would say, the kind of truth that I'm interested in is that kind of actually true thing that you're describing. It's just what is real, what is reality, right? And when I walk into the other room, I can't just choose for anything to be there, or I might bump into some furniture and hurt myself, right? There's some reality pushes back on us, and we learn by having to accommodate to that. And that's wisdom, actually. And so I think if we totally abandon the notion that reality pushes back on us, then we also abandon the notion that there's something that, again, is a better or worse way of interacting with that reality. I think we all, not all of us, certainly, many of us might have recently experienced a very profound pushback of reality upon our expectations or ideals. But that's the context for the learning, the progress, the struggle that we're engaged in. The spiritual journey itself is this, right? If our older ways of seeing God or truth or scripture or what have you, if they worked, we wouldn't have grown, we wouldn't have changed, we wouldn't have developed. But there was tension there. There was dissonance. There was maybe some suffering, maybe some a recognition that something didn't work, and so that propels us to try to be more in conformity with the way things are. And I think we can embrace that idea of things very helpfully and in a salutary way, without having to embrace harmful notions of dogmatic truth as such. And in fact, it might even be vital for, deepening into wisdom.
Well, Brendan, I'm going to wind this down, but I'm going to say this. I hope you'll indulge me for a part 2 in this. And here's why, because there's so much that I wanted to get to that we didn't get to. And that is how this metamodern Christianity collides and intersects with this current crisis of meaning that we're experiencing. So I'd love to talk to you about that. We didn't even go near where transcendence and experience, how that is affecting the future of Christianity and how important those two things are. So I hope you'll let me talk to you again, and soon we can do a part 2 on this.
I would love that. I'm honored to have had this chat, and I'd be doubly honored to have another. So I would heartily embrace that invitation, and I really appreciate, this chance to chat. I really appreciate your questions, and hopefully, what we've been talking about has resonated with folks in your audience, and look forward to round 2.
Oh, yeah. So good. Before we go, where can peeps find you? Where can people find you?
Well, if you go to myname.com, that's probably the best place, because it'll just direct you to my other things. I have a YouTube channel. I have a podcast called Metamodern Spirituality. And then it also has some links to my writing and various projects I'm working on and whatnot. So I would just say go to BrendanGrahamDempsey.com, and if you're interested, you'll find stuff there.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that. And yes, to whoever's watching and listening, go find Brendan on YouTube. Find his YouTube channel. Find all the things. He does long-form explanations and essays on this, which are really deep and rich and exciting. Look for Brendan's conversations with the cognitive psychologist John Vervaeke. These are wonderful conversations. Go to your website and/or Amazon.com and find Brendan's writings and publishings on all of this. And then after you watch this, soon tune into part 2 as Brendan and I talk about this. But hey, man, thanks so much for doing this and being on my podcast.
My great pleasure. Thanks so much. Looking forward to chatting again.
Yeah, me too.